tomorrow is the Feast of St. Patrick, and we're going to talk about St. Patrick today because I love the story of St. Patrick, and I think a lot of people, even good Irish folk who will celebrate this day and go out for the parades and the bars, don't know much about his heroic life. St. Patrick was somebody who the Irish considered an apostle. In other words, he extended the great reach and impact of those early apostles. And of course, he was the great apostle to Ireland, but he wasn't from Ireland. And I bet there's a lot of other things you don't know about St. Patrick that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Well, I love the Feast of St. Patrick. First off, because it's a feast in Lent, which gives us a little break. And I guess, it depends on if you're in Boston or New York, they give a dispensation from the Lenten fasting. And I'm about half Irish, and so I take Patrick as a claim that he's a patron so that I could take a little respite from the fasting to have a little feasting in the midst of Lent. But there's a lot of other reasons besides our break from Lenten fasting to celebrate the life of St. Patrick, especially because he was a heroic saint and lived the virtue of charity to a great degree that we're going to talk about. But he also was an entrepreneurial evangelist. He creatively found a way to take a very difficult, stiff-necked, hard-hearted, pagan people and convert them. And to me, that's a lesson that we could use today because we face great challenges with the new evangelization. And knowing the stories of great evangelization in our Catholic past gives us hope even when things get dark and really pagan in our modern society and culture. And I'm so excited to have a special guest with me. I've got Paul McCusker, who is our content creative director, and wears a lot of hats here at the Augustine Institute. He's the author of many, many books. And Paul, I want to talk to you because you were really the director of our Trials of St. Patrick audio drama that we have one of the copies right here. And maybe some of the guests had a chance to see that right before the show rolled, one of the promos for that. And I remember you preparing to do this audio drama and working on the script and researching the life of St. Patrick. And I know we've had some great conversations about Patrick, but I wanted to have you on to talk about Patrick because he's a fascinating story and a very intriguing life for people to learn about.
Well, and I didn't know just how intriguing his life was because, like a lot of people, as you mentioned, I was aware of St. Patrick. I think, like a lot of people, I was thinking of, Lucky Charms, leprechauns, and things. Yeah. But when I was digging into his life and researching it to figure out what to do with the drama, it became very clear how remarkable he was. And in terms of so much of what he did, as you said, a lot of people don't realize he wasn't Irish. He was actually from Roman Britain at the time.
Yeah, and that doesn't go over so well with a lot of Irish that I know when they discover that the great patron of Ireland is actually a Brit.
Well, it made it difficult when we were casting and trying to figure out what accent he should use, because we figured if we used a British accent, we would have a lot of problems with the Irish saying, well, why is he talking that way? But in fact, he would have been speaking Latin and not had an accent that we recognize anyway. But no, his British background, probably say the west of England. He was the son of a decurion. He was a deacon, a decurion who was a Roman official. So he was fairly well-to-do, reasonably well-to-do. But as a lot of people may not realize, he was captured as a slave. I mean, the Roman Empire was kind of pulling back from Britain, which was sort of the back of beyond anyway, and Ireland was even worse. It was sort of way out there. And it was Patrick who he was kind of on the west away, and then you had invading forces coming in from the east, from the west, and coming over from Ireland, from these pagan tribes, coming over to get slaves. So he was one of them, apparently one of thousands that had been nabbed.
Paul, let me go back, and you brought up a key point that Patrick grows up in what we call Britain or England today, and wealthy family, his father's established, but he gets taken as a slave. And just to give people a sense, like you said, the Roman Empire is in decline. It can't defend its borders. Different tribes and barbarians are raiding and doing different things. And so civilization, as the Romans knew it, is starting to really kind of fall apart. And where Patrick is, he, of course, is going to feel this personally because he's, as you said, he's taken as a slave. So he's captured and by pirates who then sell him as a slave. But when that happens, what I think is so striking is he's age 16.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, what a time for, you know, we talk about adolescence, you know, you get taken and he's then shipped off to Ireland. And, you know, we don't think of Ireland and England being that far apart, but in that day and age, that was quite a distance. You go across the ocean in a small ship, and he's taken to a foreign culture where he doesn't know the language, and he's now property. So like you said before, you know, grew up in a pretty well-to-do family, and now he's property, like cattle, right?
Right, exactly. And I mean, apart from the upheaval that anybody would experience when they're suddenly yanked from their culture into this other culture, you have Patrick who, and one of the things that struck me, in fact, you and I talked about it when we were doing the drama, was, so Patrick, by his own admission, because we have a couple of letters of his, this is why we know quite a bit of what we do know about him. And in his letters, he talked about how at the time he was nabbed, he had pretty much abandoned anything other than faith in really the Romans, and they were on the decline, ironically. But he had been raised as a Christian, but he admitted that he had pretty much put aside any real faith. But
that's such an important point, I think, because people think, okay, first off, they thought, you know, Patrick came from Ireland, but then they think, okay, he gets taken to, you know, to Ireland if they know that much of the story, but they kind of think he was always devout. But when he's taken as a slave, he does not have a living faith, as he would probably articulate it, right?
No,
faith is something
not
distant.
At all. In fact, he had more or less rejected it. And yet here's I think, an important thing, especially for those of us who are parents, because what happened is he was a slave for 7 years. And he was put like on this mountain to take care of sheep and take care of livestock, and left out there in all sorts of weather, the deprivations of it. Sometimes he didn't have anything to eat. He didn't have shelter. He says all of this in his letter. But what came to his mind was everything he'd been taught. Scriptures came back to mind. The teachings of the church came back to mind. And God used that. And Patrick's very clear about this. In fact, he later saw his enslavement as a chance to be free. That God actually used slavery as the means by which God could speak to him, speak into his heart. But what I think is really keen is that he actually brought to mind those things he had learned and had put aside, but they came back to him in his darkest hour.
I love how you describe that in the audio drama. And just to give people a backdrop, if you haven't listened to the audio dramas that we produce, they're done with a full score of professional actors. We record this in London. And I love you. Let's just talk about the two actors you got to play Patrick to give people an example of this.
Well, we positioned it as sort of older Patrick in front of a tribunal, which is kind of the cause of one of the letters that he wrote. He's given a defense of his ministry. And so he's in front of this tribunal, played by John Rhys Davis, who everybody knows from everything. He was Lord of the Rings, Indiana Jones. I mean, you can go through
fantastic actor with a great booming voice.
Yeah.
I mean, Patrick, you know, I love how the Irish said he was an apostle. I mean, this is bigger than life kind of character, and John Rhys Davies makes Patrick a bigger than life character. I mean,
and you believe it. You believe he had the authority to do what he did. But he went over as a young man. I mean, Patrick was in Ireland for 40 years.
Well, let's talk about the young actor then
Right.
that played the younger Patrick.
We cast a young actor from Dublin, Sean T. O'Malley, who was brilliant. Came in, actually looks like Patrick, a young Patrick. You look at pictures of him and you go, well, you know what, if I were filming him, I would definitely put him in this.
Yeah, you cast him.
And he came in, and of course we had the two of them trying to match each other to a great degree in their accents and what they were approaching, so that you didn't get sort of a discordance between the older and younger. But he came in, and he was huge. In fact, I did something as a director that a director should never do, and I put him in the position as an expert on Irish accents. Because we had British actors, we had actors who some were not as confident in their Irish accents. In fact, they were intimidated by the fact that I had an Irishman there who was going to say, well, actually, we would say it this way, you know.
Sean's a young and up-and-coming Irish actor, and I love, just for Sean, his experience, when he came in and he was originally auditioned for a different role, and you asked him to play Patrick, and how did he receive that?
Well, he was scared. He said, I don't know, I'm Irish, and to play Patrick, if I don't do this well, they might blow up my house. I mean, you know, he really was intimidated, and to do it in England with all these English actors, renowned actors that he got to play opposite, and of course, people that he knew from films and from stage. But he was brilliant. I mean, he came in and he got the heart of it. He kind of got the naivete of someone being yanked from one culture and dropped into another. The emotion and just the pathos that he is able to express, it, for me, opened up a window. Even having read the script and having read the letters of Patrick and his confessions, it just gave me a deeper sense of the person of Patrick and the depth of his suffering, really. And let's just talk about his suffering because, like you said, he spent 6 or 7 years as a slave, fairly isolated, taking care of sheep. And of course, there's a lot of biblical characters who take care of sheep. And there's a beautiful connection to that. But he's got no one to talk to but God. And he goes back, as you said, to his earlier prayers, to the scriptures that he heard and knew. And this creates a spiritual renaissance. And I think for a lot of parents who worry about their kids as they become teenagers falling away, if they have been well catechized as children, they have something to go back to. Now, Patrick goes back to that. And let's just talk about his spiritual development at that time. Well, as I said, he was in really horrible circumstances, no shelter, often foods, he was wearing rags. And as the time went on, he found himself praying constantly, he said. He was praying without ceasing, pretty much, and praying to God and using the time in isolation, praying to God, thinking through the Psalms, remembering the Scripture, remembering the teachings of the church. And rather than succumb to bitterness, rather than succumb to this, God, where are you? He actually was very much aware of God's presence throughout, especially as his time went on, to the degree then that he used that time. Again, I think it's an important lesson for us. We often get into dark times and think God's abandoned us. And it's like, God, where are you? No, God is there. God remains there. It's not like he ever left, and it's not like he's turned his back on us. He's there, but the question is, what are we supposed to be doing with this time? What is it an opportunity? We can wallow in self-pity, or we can do what Patrick did and begin to think, meditate, prayer, use the time to get closer to the God that he believed put him in this position. Yeah, and that's how it played out.
I think that's so important for people to understand that, you know, suffering can lead us closer to God. And sometimes we don't want our children to ever suffer. And yet, God uses that. I think of the story of St. Joseph. In the Old Testament, Joseph gets sold as a slave, and yet that's going to bring a journey that's going to bring him much closer to God, as well as redemption for Israel. I want to just let everybody know that you can send in your questions and your comments for us, and the text line is 720-650-0100. So text us your questions about St. Patrick, about the Trials of St. Patrick audio drama. Any questions you have on Patrick, we would love for you to join our conversation. Well, Paul, let's go back to, as we're talking about the life of Patrick here. So at the end of this, he becomes really spiritually attuned. What's the trigger for him escaping from Ireland?
Well, it's a voice. Basically, God speaks to him and gives him a couple of messages. And one of the messages was, your ship is waiting. A bad paraphrase, but the gist of it was, time to go. Your ship is waiting for you. And according to his account, and as best as we can figure out, he then escaped, which might have seemed easy because he was on this mountain anyway. But as soon as they would have seen that he had escaped, they would have been searching for him. And he went something like 200 miles.
The danger of someone being found as a runaway slave. What would be the typical punishment?
Well, the punishment would have been everything from obvious beatings and a degree of torture, hobbling them so they might never run away again, and death. And a lot of times it was just death. It's like, we don't have time to be messing around with this, so we're just going to kill you.
I don't think people have a sense of, for him to escape Ireland, he can't just run to the airport, take a train, or just, he's on an island.
Right.
You know, and it's an island where everybody, he has the foreign accent. It's clear that he's a foreigner, and he's going to escape, and that's going to take pretty much a miracle, don't you think?
Well, and it did, and he describes it as that. I mean, to get 200 miles and not be captured, of course, he hid. He was in rags. I mean, it's not like he had a change of clothes buried somewhere that he could put on and then blend in. I mean, pretty much he would have been known anywhere and everywhere as a slave. But he got to the coast and he found this ship, And because of sensitivity to time, he didn't. He basically kind of haggled with the captain. And another miracle was that the captain agreed to let him come on board in order to serve the ship and basically to work his passage. And so they left. They were able to leave. And but this is where the story gets a little bit confusing, because as we understand, it might have been 3 days' journey, and there's a lot of debate about what happened and where they wound up, because they wound up on a coast. And some believe it's the extreme west coast of England, and some believe that it was actually France. And they were wandering for some 28, 29 days. And you're trying to figure out, where could you actually wander for 28 or 29 days without seeing anybody? And when you finally see people, you're not seeing very many of them. So there's some confusion about that. And where there's confusion among the scholars, I get to make a choice dramatically. So I made my choice for our drama. But they wound up seeing miracles along the way where Patrick was understood to be a Christian. They then looked to him when they were pretty much starving to death and dying of thirst. And then he actually prayed, and a miracle came by way of some pigs that suddenly showed up.
Come across a herd of swine.
Yeah, so then they feasted, and they did that, and then finally they made their way further in, strengthened. And
I love what I love about that, Paul, is that, God's providence kind of is there at all the right pivotal moments for Patrick.
Right.
That doesn't mean that God prevents Patrick from ever suffering. He suffers.
Mm-hmm.
But he's got these key moments where God turns and nudges him in the right direction. Now, Carol asks, what are the best sources to find out more about St. Patrick?
Well, there's several. I mean, there are a lot of different books. I actually
Besides our audio drama,
well,
of
the
course,
audio drama is good.
which I think that's a fabulous
I think it
introduction
works.
and a very engaging one.
There was a 19th century scholar who did a whole work on Patrick. It was, I think, one of the first where a historian took a very serious look at Patrick's life based on everything that was available then. And there is actually an annotated version by Father John Sweeney who goes through Barry's work and then also updates it, does some sidebars illuminating some of the information. I found it hugely helpful. It's sort of consolidated, but then I cross-reference to a lot of the hagiographies, the Tripart Life that was written a couple of hundred years after him, maybe more, cross-referencing, looking for the stories that would make sense to me to put in a drama, because I couldn't put everything. So that's where I would point them to.
And of course, one of the other sources for the audio drama of St. Patrick, as well as those later biographies, is Patrick's own confessions, his own words. Right. We do have a short treatise that he wrote, his own confessions, kind of like Augustine's Confessions. Mm-hmm. He writes his own confessions. We'll come back later on, maybe as we talk about towards the end of Patrick's life, to talk about what is the occasion for that happening. Patricia asks, how long does it generally take for you to write a script and to develop a narrative? So that's a great question.
It depends on what deadline you give me, actually, come to think of it. No, it varies. The 4 that we've done with Francis, we were pretty much on a crunch time-wise to get it done and get it done in time for his feast day. So we, in that case, I think I did that one in about 6 weeks, I think, maybe less.
Yeah, the script writing itself, but the research, there's a lot of time of research.
Well, and that's
that
it.
Too.
I actually tend to write while I'm researching. Mm-hmm. I begin to outline and piece together, this is a great story, I've got to make sure this is in here. So even as I'm researching in the different places where I may look, I'm piecing it together in order to start working on the script and then jump headlong into the script to bring shape to that.
Now, what leads Patrick to go back to Ireland? This guy miraculously escapes from being a slave amongst these pagans, because in Ireland, we just have to probably say for our people, there were Christians in Britain at that time because the Roman Empire had extended there, but really, the Romans never took Ireland. It was always pretty wild
they couldn't.
and pagan, so they couldn't take Ireland.
Yeah.
And so there's no sense of cities and roads, what the Romans would call civilization.
Right.
The Irish were completely uncivilized.
Right.
Right?
They weren't even sure they had souls. I mean, this was a big battle. When God calls to Patrick, Patrick gets home. He's reunited with whatever family is left, what other friends are left, and we're not even sure who those were. I dramatized that. But then God calls him out, and it's basically the voice of the Irish are calling you. They're crying for you. And here's a man who had been enslaved. He comes out, God is calling him back to those who enslaved him in order to lead them to Christ, to bring the gospel to them, to bring the church to them. And understandably, there's a lot of confusion, especially among family and friends, and among church leaders who would be looking at it and saying, why would you go back? These are animals. These aren't even, we're not sure they have souls for you to go save. And so it really confounded them that he said, but God has told me to do it, I'm going.
Yeah, God puts this call on his heart. And I love for Patrick, and I think it's captured very well in the audio drama, there's this desire out of charity, his love for Christ. He actually cares for these people, and he wants to bring the light of Jesus Christ and the gospel to these people in Ireland. And so there's a role of forgiveness here that's pretty significant.
Well, and I think that's what was quickening in his heart. And I think it started in his time of solitude, where God is speaking to him through Scripture, through the teachings of the church. And even when he took the boat, his desire when he got on that boat of pagans was, well, I might be able to lead them to Christ. I might be able to share Christ with them. So that 28, 29 days with its ensuing miracle certainly made an impact. So for God to call him back, and then for him to spend possibly 14, 15 years preparing for it. It's not like he got the call and he left. He did it, forgive the expression, by the book. He said, well, I need to become a deacon. I need to become a priest. I need to have the authority of the church to be able to go back to do the work that God is calling me to do. And so the scholars estimate it might have been another 14, 15 years while he studied before he went.
One of the things I love about how he begins his confessions is, I'm Patrick, a sinner and a simple man. And he's certainly has the sense, because when he's taken as a slave at age 16 to go take care of cattle and sheep, his education is right at a key moment cut off. And so now as an adult, a young man of, in his early 20s, he's got to go back and learn. He's got to learn Latin, but he learns Latin enough.
Right.
But he's never, most people who become bishops and significant leaders in the church, they have a much more erudite education than Patrick was able to have. And he had a sense. How did he handle that?
Well, we touched on that. There was a degree of bigotry in a way, because he didn't write very well. In fact, the scholars have said that his letters, the 2 letters that we have of his, are a bit crude, a bit rough around the edges, grammatically and otherwise. And I speculated that he had a hard time in class, with all the studies to become a priest, as he ultimately did, and later become bishop. And I think there was probably the sense that, here's this guy from the back of beyond. He's a bit of a hick, and he doesn't speak very well, and yet God is telling him to go to these people. We don't know why he wants to go there, but okay, God has told him to. So I think it caused him some degree of problems that then created problems for him later on, which led to the letter that he had to write.
Well, but he even if he wasn't sophisticated with the kind of polish that a great education at that time would give, he was a bright man. I mean, he came up with a way of converting the Irish. And let's just talk about his work as a missionary in Ireland.
Well, and I want to, my view is that he was strategic, very strategic. This wasn't let's get on a boat, I'm going to go, drop me off and I'll figure it out when I get there. I honestly believe that he took provisions, livestock, he took whatever coinage he could use in order to pay his way through Ireland. Because you were dealing with all these different tribes. All of them were pretty much autonomous. You might have had the single king who was chosen for the time, probably because of power and strength. But every time you wandered, it'd be like us wandering from town to town, and every new town, you needed to be prepared to pay for protection, pay for permission to be there, and pay for the right to even set up a church that was working against the established Druid religion that was there.
Well, let's just talk about, you mentioned the Druid religion, and Chris asked a question, what were the Irish like in Patrick's day, and their lifestyle and their religion? So let's just talk about the religion.
Well, the Druid, and we don't know a lot about it, and the speculation is they worship nature, that they were the dominant religion.
Human sacrifice?
Well, and it's debated now, but I think there's strong evidence that there was human sacrifice, especially children. They sacrificed children to the various gods, and in particular, I guess the main god, or the worst of the gods, was Crom Cruach. And they were most afraid of him. And so when Patrick goes over, he's dealing with that. So to answer the question, you're dealing with tribes. You're dealing with sort of a unified religion, but each town was subject to the Druid priest who was there and whatever he decided, who was going to be sacrificed or what they had to give by way of grain for the harvest, that sort of thing.
So it's a religion of fear and
Yes.
superstition and paganism, and yet Patrick's able to work with that. And what does he? Obviously they have a sense of the supernatural, as a pagan religion. What does Patrick bring with his Catholic faith that's going to counteract that?
Well, I think that's what's fascinating, and we touch on it in the drama, and that is Patrick didn't go in with an assumption that he was going to reason with them, that he was going to give them a tract that was going to spell out rationally and reasonably why they should believe in Jesus as the Son of God. He didn't have a search program like we have. So he went in, and rather than go in with some sort of an argument, he went in with the sacraments. He went in with the power of something that they would understand. They would understand the power of water and then understand it when, by authority, he would say, this is what baptism does. The body and blood of Christ, everything that he took with him, as Barry says, as a historian, he was a secular historian, who basically said it was probably the only thing that could have worked. Patrick had to go in with the sacraments because the pagan mind could understand that power in a way they wouldn't have understood a lot of documents and a lot of Platonic or Socratic method discussions. It was that sort of thing.
Let me ask you another question in the short amount of time we have. Sarah asks, the Feast of St. Patrick now has become so secularized. You've got this secular parade in New York that, how do people celebrate this feast in a way that would be truly Catholic?
Well, I think as we do with many of the saints, we celebrate their lives and we celebrate the thing that made them saints. I mean, Patrick overcame a lot of obstacles in order to follow God's call. That to me is the common denominator, that they were willing to do what God asked them to do no matter what. And Patrick did. He was up against a lot. This was not something that was easy for him to do, not even emotionally, because he was a slave there, but to go back and to navigate that country with all the labyrinth of power structures that it had, for him to go through, by the grace of God, to overcome the Druids, overcome the power structures, and introduce Christ to them, and to bring the church there and plant it throughout the country as he did. I think that's inspiring, because we then have to look at how God is calling us in this time, in this place, to do much the same, and are we willing to say yes?
I think, for Sarah's question too, I would say that, this is why we're doing what we're doing. I think a lot of Catholics, it was the custom of, if you're Irish, you have St. Patrick, or you're not Irish, but you hear about this great guy, St. Patrick. And with this kind of cultural Catholicism, we've lost the meaning. And I love one of the things that you mentioned, that, Sean T. O'Malley, who played the young Patrick, he discovered Patrick. So here we have this great young actor from Dublin in Ireland. And as he reads the script and does this story, he comes to a rediscovery of St. Patrick. And that's really what we want for everybody, to kind of, listen to these audio dramas so that we can go back to the sources, go back to the reason behind. And
let's celebrate the real Patrick as opposed to the Lucky Charms leprechaun that everyone drinks to.
Exactly. And I think that's going to be crucial, because I think there is a secularization of the feast. But the way that we overcome that is we discover the true Patrick and getting our kids to listen to the audio drama, to read the life of St. Patrick, and to obviously go to Mass on the Feast of St. Patrick. These are great things to celebrate and to do, and to bring these kinds of models. And one of the things I love that, Paul, you did in this audio drama is Patrick is a heroic story. It's a story of great courage, confronting the paganism. And, we are in need of courage. And having our children and ourselves listen to these great stories with these great actors who really make the life of Patrick come alive, I think that gives us courage. And I think that's exactly what we need in this day and age. And that's going to be really, really important. And I think that that's why I hope that you can find, by the way, the audio drama of St. Patrick. You can find this on Formed. And so it's on formed.org. You can find it. Just search for Trials of St. Patrick, and you can find it, listen to it. And then, next week, we're going to talk about forgiveness. And of course, for St. Patrick, I think one of the great things that unleashes grace and conversion for the Irish is Patrick's own forgiveness of those who enslaved him and mistreated him. And with charity, he goes back and brings the good news of Jesus Christ to them, and that unleashes all kinds of grace. And next week, I think a great Lenten theme is forgiveness. And I have a dear friend, Tim Jeffries, who is going to give an incredible story of forgiveness in his own life, where he had to forgive those who murdered his brother. And it's a compelling story, and one that we all need to hear, I think, as we hear these models, ancient models like St. Patrick and newer models today of people who have to walk in the gospel and learn how to forgive. And we all need that skill these days. So I hope that you can join us next week as we talk about forgiveness with Tim Jeffries, and I hope that you get a chance to celebrate in a Catholic way the Feast of St. Patrick tomorrow. God bless you.